Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future of Wellness. Thanks so much for your patience whilst we've taken an extended summer break from guest interviews. We're so excited to be here with you again.
It's been a beautiful pause. We've been in deep creation behind the scenes, refining our training program, hosting new events, and dreaming up some really exciting next steps for the podcast and for Field Dynamics as a whole.
So we're back now, and over the next few months, you can expect more dynamic and engaging conversations that dive even deeper into what we all love exploring, from the latest insights in mental health and human consciousness to the science of the biofield, subtle energy, and the living intelligence that connects us all.
We've also got some new content series coming your way, short focused episodes, and also some longer explorations where we'll unpack the principles and practices that underpin everything we teach and explore here at Field Dynamics.
So to ease us all back in, today we wanted to start with something light, earthy, and delicious. A fun guest conversation we recorded over the summer break with fermentation expert Sandor Katz, who has been described by the New York Times as one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene.
Sandor has spent decades reviving the art of fermentation around the world. We talked about gut health, microbial wisdom, and what it really means to collaborate with life itself.
It's a perfect episode to reopen the season, equal parts science, story, and soul. So do settle in and let's dive into this conversation with Sandor. Welcome to the Future of Wellness, exploring self-transformation and holistic healing to unlock your inner potential. Hosted by Christabel Armston and Keith Parker.
Welcome to this episode of the Future of Wellness. Today we're joined by Sandor Katz, a fermentation revivalist. His books Wild Fermentation from 2003 and The Art of Fermentation from 2012, along with hundreds of fermentation workshops he has taught around the world, have helped to catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. A self-taught experimentalist who lives in rural Tennessee, the New York Times calls him one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene, and notes that he has become for fermentation what Timothy Leary was for psychedelic drugs, a charismatic, consciousness-raising thinker and advocate who wants people to see the world in a new way. The Art of Fermentation received a James Beard Award, and in 2014, Sandor was honored with the Craig Claiborne Lifetime Achievement Award from the Southern Foodways Alliance. Sandor, it is a pleasure to have you with us here today.
So happy to be with you.
So some people may know of your journey who are listening, but could you give us kind of a snapshot of what journey led you to getting so deeply into fermented foods and having this be your life's work?
Well, I mean, it really was not a single thing. I mean, I would say that, my journey into fermentation had several distinct steps to it. Number one, in my youth, in New York City, as the grandson of immigrants from Eastern Europe, I loved pickles. We always had pickles in the refrigerator. The kinds of pickles my family were eating are, what are sometimes called kosher dills. In New York, we call them sour pickles, but they're fermented cucumbers. There's no vinegar involved in the process. Now, as a kid, I didn't know this, but for whatever reason, I was very strongly drawn to the flavor of fermented pickles, and I also liked sauerkraut. So there were flavors of fermentation that I just found myself drawn to before I knew anything about fermentation. Then when I was in my mid-20s, I spent a few years following a macrobiotic diet. And one of the things that macrobiotics emphasizes is the digestive benefit of pickles and other live ferments. And I started noticing that these pickles that I'd been eating my entire life, whenever I would eat them, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. So I really began to associate these foods with getting my digestive juices flowing in a very tangible way, and really started seeking them out as a health practice. But I still wasn't really making anything myself until when I was 30 years old. I moved from New York, where I had lived my life until that point, to rural Tennessee. And I started keeping a garden. And, really the catalyst for me, investigating how to ferment food myself was having a garden and suddenly realizing like, oh my God, all of the cabbage is ready at about the same time. All of the cucumbers are ready at about the same time. All of the radishes are ready at about the same time. So, that was really the catalyst that got me learning how to ferment in my own kitchen. And then once I was doing it, I was like, wow, this is straightforward. The results are so delicious. I feel so good when I'm eating them all the time. And I just started experimenting, and then I went down the whole rabbit hole. Now, I mean, you probably have read in some versions of the story that I was dealing with HIV through this, and that absolutely is true, and that's a big part of what made me make the decision to move to Tennessee and try to be growing organic vegetables and eating better. And in some versions of the story, people have the idea that I somehow cured HIV using fermented foods, and I certainly wish that was the story. But I did have a period where I got very sick, and I got on meds, and I've been on meds for the last 30 years. I'm not trying to tell people that fermented foods are a panacea that will solve all of your problems and enable you to live forever. However, I love making them. They're delicious. I do think that they contribute in really profound ways to health and well-being. My mission really for the last 25 years, certainly since the time when wild fermentation came out in 2003, has been, demystifying this process because we live in this a germ-phobic world where people associate bacteria with danger, disease, and death. A lot of people project their anxiety about bacteria onto the idea of fermentation. So simply the thought of shredding vegetables, salting them, and stuffing them in a jar to sit there for a few weeks really is very scary and intimidating to a lot of people. And it's easy to, imagine that that's potentially dangerous, even though that makes the vegetables safer than they were raw. Fermentation in every application is a strategy for safety, as well as to preserve food, to make food more delicious, to make food more easily digestible, to relieve toxic compounds from foods, to produce alcohol. So, there's a whole range of, practical benefits to fermentation. That's all preceded by safety, because what good is a preserved food? What good is a delicious food if eating it is like playing Russian roulette? So I mean, fermentation really above all else is a strategy for food safety.
Thanks, Sandor. Love that. Um, you've spoken about the body previously as an ecosystem, as many experts do. I'd love to hear how your understanding of gut health, microbial symbiosis, and inner ecology has shifted your view of wellness as this sort of interdependent phenomena. And it ties in a little to what you were just sharing there at the end, I think, around this perspective people have around where bacteria fits in our concept of health and wellness.
I mean, the very first, where microbiology and the recognition of bacteria and yeast really starts with an investigation of fermentation. That's how Louis Pasteur happened to be in a position to discover bacteria and other microorganisms. Was he was investigating fermentation for an alcohol manufacturer. And had this really important insight that the process was driven by the biological process of bacteria and yeast. But sort of following that insight, the primary public accomplishments of the field of microbiology involved pathogenic bacteria, and identifying pathogens. And I mean, there's no denying that there are certain bacteria and other microorganisms that have the potential to make us sick. However, the vast majority of organisms we can coexist with perfectly well. And in fact, our greatest protection from the pathogens is biodiversity, having, rich, strong, biodiverse communities of organisms, that can keep the pathogens away. And, what has just been increasingly revealed since those earliest insights of microbiology is that, bacteria are the matrix for all life. In the field of evolutionary biology, there's a widespread recognition that bacteria and other prokaryotic cells like archaea, really spawned all life. And that, like all the multicellular organisms such as us and plants and fungi are composed of cells that are called eukaryotic cells. And the prevailing idea right now in evolutionary thinking is that eukaryotic cells were created in the first place billions of years ago by symbiosis of bacteria, and it was or of prokaryotic cells, not necessarily bacteria. Also, there are these cells called archaea, but that symbiosis became sort of institutionalized, and the reproduction became coordinated, and became this other kind of cell with greater complexity and greater specialization that sort of spawned, all animals, all plants, all fungi, all multicellular forms of life. And so, we really are limiting our view of the world if we imagine that bacteria are these, evil actors that are, out to get us, that we have to always protect ourselves from. When in fact, ourselves and all other multicellular beings, evolved with bacteria and have never lived without bacteria. And, we've become increasingly aware of the idea that, every healthy human adult is host to, mind-boggling numbers in the trillions of bacteria and other microorganisms. And these organisms, we couldn't possibly function without them. They regulate all kinds of systems in our bodies. They enable us to digest food. They synthesize certain essential nutrients for us. What we call our immune system is largely the work of bacteria in our intestines. So, I mean, they're just important to every aspect of our lives. And then, meanwhile, we're living in a world with all this chemical exposure that can kill bacteria, that can diminish the biodiversity in and on our bodies, and at the same time, dietary changes, over the last, century or so, have resulted in people eating a lot less fiber. Fiber is such, critical food for the bacteria, sort of downstream in our digestive systems. And, all of these factors are basically creating a diminishment of biodiversity in our human bodies. And I think what's so, exciting and powerful about fermented foods is that, they offer us a way to, support biodiversity, enhance biodiversity, improve biodiversity by eating bacteria-rich foods.
This podcast is the future of wellness, and in terms of eating and nutrition these days, there's a real crisis. Many people are sick in record percentage numbers, and a lot of things are being tracked back to our digestive system, the food we're eating, gut health, these kinds of things. It's so rampant, it's really quite astonishing. It seems like all of the food traditions of the world, pretty much all that I'm aware of, do have fermented foods as a mainstay or as a part of the regular diet. How critical do you think it is for people to come back to the inclusion of fermented foods in the regular diet? Like you said, people are almost estranged from these things, and to learn that a probiotic pill that you buy as a supplement, which has some kind of shelf-stable, billions of strains, or rather a handful of strains and billions of probiotics, pales in comparison to the density of the bacterial richness of something like sauerkraut. Like how important do you think this is, the revival of this in terms of bringing back health to the masses, if that's not too much to say?
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. I agree with you there. Now, okay, when we consider like why is fermentation practiced everywhere? I mean, it's not because, our ancestors thousands of years ago sort of needed to seek out bacteria-rich foods. That's not why people started fermenting. Our whole conception of bacteria, the way we're thinking about it has only been possible for the last 150 years or something. I mean, the reason why fermentation is practiced everywhere is the simple reality that we now recognize that everything we eat, all of the plants, all of the animal products, anything that, could possibly be considered food is populated by microorganisms. So, there's a certain inevitability to microbial transformation of our food. And, of course, like fermented delicacies are not the only possibilities of how microorganisms can transform food. And, when we watch, something we bought at the supermarket, start to mold or start to decompose and liquefy, nobody's pulling out the bag of like, decomposed parsley buried in the back of their produce drawer and saying like, "Oh my God, the parsley fermented. Let's have it for dinner." I mean, that's basically food spoilage. That's the food decomposing. As a practical matter, people everywhere, without knowing about bacteria, just recognize that, under certain environmental conditions, rather than decomposing, food could become more stable, become more delicious, become more easily digestible, lose their toxicity, turn into alcohol. It's all based on what people could observe, and really what all fermentation practices amount to are simple manipulations of environmental conditions so as to encourage the growth of certain kinds of organisms while simultaneously discouraging the growth of other kinds of organisms. And now we recognize that, eating fermented foods, if they're not cooked after their fermentation, is a great source of probiotics. So, these foods have been present all along, like wherever your ancestors, might have been from, people were fermenting something, and probably lots of things. Now, in terms of probiotics, like, yes, I think probiotics have become more important than ever before. But, my caveat is that, probiotics alone won't do it. Like, I agree with you that, like, any kind of naturally fermented food, if it's eaten without cooking it after its fermentation, is going to, be a much more effective probiotic than a capsule, mostly because, that capsule just has one or two or maybe three strains of bacteria and lots of copies of those. Whereas, any kind of traditionally fermented food is going to, be an embodiment of biodiversity. And that's really ultimately what probiotics is about. It's about enhancing biodiversity in the gut. Just eating the bacteria-rich food alone doesn't really solve the problem. Like, we have to change our diets and eat more fiber, and fiber is found in whole foods. So much of our diet is things that are, highly processed. And, I'm not against food processing. Fermentation's a form of food processing. People like to have, oils to cook with. Those don't just appear as they are. Those require some sort of processing. I mean, food processing in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but we just, by just taking certain parts of it and getting rid of the bran on the grains, getting rid of the fiber of the fruit, we need all of that fiber. So, probiotics is great and can be profound, but it needs to be in the context of broader dietary changes. And, I think, in our culture, people sometimes are so, they just want a they just want a magic bullet. And so okay, it's going to be probiotics. I'm going to, have a little portion of sauerkraut every day, but it needs to be in a larger context. And then all the biome researchers who I've talked to, really emphasize that, like, fiber is what keeps the populations of bacteria in our intestines, sort of thriving and biodiverse.
You're touching on some really key points here, Sandor. It feels as if the very act of fermentation, and for anyone who's even had a little bit of a go, it often requires time, requires patience. We might say at Field Dynamics, it requires presence, right, in the sense of being available to the foodstuffs and the process that you're implementing. You're talking, it sounds like, the changes that we're witnessing broadly in dietary conditions, really, around this deeper cultural conditioning around how it is and what we eat, and the disconnect from nature, from rhythm, from ritual, even that reference earlier in a world that's sort of increasingly obsessed with sterility and control, right? Fermentation has been described as something of a radical act in that context. So is this a disconnect? I think what you're sharing is that this is a disconnect that isn't just about fermentation. It's about the art of engaging with, growing and connecting to our food as a whole.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, fermentation, exists in a context, and I mean, personally, my feeling is that, um, we we need to get closer to the source of our food. We have, you know, I mean, up until relatively recent times, basically like every other kind of animal, people were mostly occupied with, how to feed themselves, and whether it's foraging, hunter gathering, farming, gardening, agriculture. Most people throughout time have been engaged in the act of feeding themselves. And, you know, um, um, in some ways we've been liberated from that because we have this complex system, and something like 1% of people, at least here in the United States, actually work in the production of food, and the other 99% of people have been, liberated from having to spend their time doing that. And um, I mean, I guess that's a great thing that people are able to do so many other things, but the system that's enabled us to sort of have 1% of the people produce food for 99% of the people, has relied on, technologies which more and more people are agreeing are, destroying our soils and our capacity to feed ourselves into the future. The chemicals we're using are destroying waterways, having damaging impact on other kinds of organisms and our ecosystems. I mean, the system we've created is very destructive, and it's very vulnerable. And I think that, we saw that during COVID. I think we're seeing that with sort of the new US trade policies. But these systems of these global food systems, I mean, they're great while we've got them, but they're vulnerable. And I just think, like, even like apart from the question of individual health and well-being, I think, as a society, we are all in a more secure position if the majority of what we eat can come from, the region around where we live. And I'm not saying everybody has to stop what they're doing and become a farmer, but we need to, support people who are producing food locally. We need policies that that support and encourage local and regional food production. And I'm not against trade at all. However, I just think it leaves people in a very vulnerable position if the majority of what they're eating is coming from faraway places, and could be subject to these kinds of disruptions.
A brief pause to thank you for listening to this episode. If you're looking to take the next step in your transformation, find out how we can support you with our popular energy healing training, one-to-one private sessions, free resources, and more. Visit energyfielddynamics.com to learn more. Your book, Wild Fermentation's over 20 years old, and it's become a kind of cult classic, certainly ahead of its time regarding this subject. Did you ever imagine it would resonate with so many people? And like, what's the different conversation you're having now than then? What is it that's so different 20 years on?
I mean, one thing is because I had been obsessed with all things fermented for, some years before I wrote Wild Fermentation. I you know, I recognized that there was, some subset of the population that was very, very interested in fermentation, just because I had had so many conversations with people where, I showed up with something fermented, or I talked about fermentation projects I was doing, and people got really excited and like, oh, my grandparents used to do something like that. I just heard a lot of stories like that, and a lot of just like sadness at having like lost these strands of cultural continuity. So I knew that there was like some degree of interest. I mean, I certainly didn't know how much interest there would be. I certainly expected that, they would print 2,000 copies of Wild Fermentation and I'd have a book out there in the world and that would be that. I mean, I had no idea, sort of how much it would resonate with people, or that, 27 years later, I'd be, talking on a podcast with people on another continent about all this. Um, but the interest has been steady and has been growing. And are the conversations I'm having with people different? I mean, I don't really think so. I mean, I think that, more people are interested, more people are buying the books. I'm getting more invitations to teach. So, I mean, it's clear to me that, interest in this in this subject is really growing. But I always knew that, that there was like, some core of interest in this project. And I would really date the sort of rise in interest in the topic of fermentation to the Human Microbiome Project. And I think that, sort of once, I mean, certainly in the time that I was growing up, I never heard a good word about bacteria. It was almost like bacteria existed to be diseases. And that was the end of the story. And I don't think that, anybody growing up now could possibly think that. I just think like, in your most basic science classes, people are learning that, the importance of bacteria in the gut. And so I think that, really since that time, there's just been there's been a growing interest in fermentation. Although I do love to point out to people that, although awareness of fermentation, interest in fermentation as fermentation has been growing, people today are not eating dramatically more fermented foods or beverages than, in your great grandparents' time or their great grandparents' time. Like the actual foods and beverages have really enjoyed enduring interest. I mean, people have eaten this since before we've been writing down history. Like fermented foods and beverages are just so ancient, so ubiquitous. They've just been part of our lives forever.
We were fortunate enough to meet you in person, Sandor, at an event in the US earlier this year. And when you spoke, we were particularly compelled about how you saw fermentation in your travels around the world as this form of dialogue, as you mentioned there, strands of cultural continuity, right? Connection, time, tradition. Can you share something of your journeys or any standout experiences of seeing different cultures around the world engaging with this practice?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, fermentation is practiced everywhere. Because of the inevitability of it. Um, and, in general, nobody's really fermenting foods that are, precious or rare. What people generally ferment are things that are abundant in a particular environment. So that's just going to be different everywhere. The first time I was teaching in Colombia, there was a festival in Bogota that was mostly focused on chicha, which is a sort of a broad range of fermented beverages, some alcoholic, some not alcoholic, that people around South America enjoy. But there were some other at this festival. There were definitely other things going on, and I met this I met this guy named Paco, who was making a beverage called Guarapo de Piña from pineapples, and it was like it could not be simpler. He was just grating whole pineapples, skin, flesh, juice, everything. In this very sort of interesting old style, handmade grater. And then it was just spontaneously fermenting, and then they were pressing it and drinking the fermented pineapple juice. Now, where I live, that would be hard to make. I mean, of course, pineapples are available here, but they're shipped from thousands of miles away, and they're kind of expensive and kind of precious. It only made sense to make that in the context of a place where pineapples grow and there's a lot of pineapples. And in fact, in his indigenous group in the Amazon, it turns out that the guarapo de piña is an important ceremonial beverage that's used as the center of a sort of ritualistic change of season ceremony that his indigenous group does every year. So it's the timing of the ceremony is driven by when the pineapples grow. And so they have all these pineapples and they make this guarapo de piña. But everything, whether it's like places that make sauerkraut, they're making it in the autumn when the cabbages are being harvested, and generally those are cold places with limited growing seasons. So really the idea of the sauerkraut is to sustain people, give people a way to have vegetables through the winter where there's not going to be any fresh vegetables. And so everywhere you go, you just find practices that reflect the climate and the seasonality and the sort of specific abundances that people in those places have.
I keep picking up on this emphasis on like interdependence, the interdependence between microbial life within our bodies and the overall body, the interdependence between ourselves and the land we're living on, the culture that we're within. So many of the issues that we face now seem to be about disconnecting with this kind of interdependence. How do you envision having balance when so many things are artificial now? Like how do you prescribe balance when a lot of people aren't going to become farmers or be very connected to the land or have these kinds of rhythms with nature?
I mean, in general, like I don't feel like I'm trying to prescribe anything for anyone. Like I'm trying to give people tools. Like in the beginning, I was like, everybody should ferment, and now, it's like I recognize that like there's a lot of people who just have no interest in doing anything in the kitchen. I mean, I feel sad for them, but like I'm not gonna try to convince them. Certainly I'm glad that there are more and more, commercially available fermented foods that are available. So I mean, I'm not trying to prescribe things, but I do think that as we need to find our way to reconnect to those things. And I'm not saying every single individual has to, but we have to have more engagement. I mean, I think really ultimately a lot of the environmental devastation that we're seeing has to do with just our disconnect from the world right around us. And I think that the world will be a better place, if more people can get can get more connected just to, the plants right outside their house, supporting local producers. I mean, I think that like you don't have to do it yourself. Like, but if you can, if you can find local people producing things using local ingredients, I mean, that's a lot more connected to the environment than like going to the biggest supermarket chain. And even if in your individual life, you're not, making those, connections to plants, connections to soil. At least we can become, a stronger part of a, human community that, by association connects more.
You mentioned earlier, Sandor, this increasing awareness of the gut microbiome, right? And I think even more recently, this extension to the oral microbiome, right? People are getting really curious about that whole passage of the digestive tract. There's been a lot of interesting discoveries around that impact, not just on physical health, but the status of that system in relation to mental health, right? Emotional well-being. Are you able to share a little? Do you have expertise in particular in how these fermented foods are sort of impacting through the system in this way, and more broadly through the psychology of the body as well as the physicality?
Sure, a little bit. I mean, that's certainly been one of the, great insights of recent years is, how many different systems of the body are affected by the bacteria. Particularly in the digestive tract, but other parts of the body. I mean, every distinct region of the body has its own microbiome. And so, there's an armpit microbiome, there's a foot microbiome. Like every part of the body is very different. But, this key insight that serotonin and other chemical compounds, that determine how we feel and how we think, are regulated in part by bacteria in the gut, has led to, an incredible amount of new research on like how people can improve their mental health through diet. And I'm certainly not an expert in that, but it seems like there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that, biodiversity in the gut can lead to improved mental health outcomes and, and people just feeling better. I mean, I hesitate to draw too direct of a connection. I hesitate to say like, oh, you're feeling depressed, you should eat sauerkraut. It'll improve your outlook. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, it certainly couldn't hurt. So why not give it a try? But I mean, it's hard. I mean, I certainly don't have the expertise to say that, that would improve anything, that like, oh, you have this digestive problem. All you need to do is eat sauerkraut. Oh, you're feeling run down and you keep on, getting colds. Oh, you should eat sauerkraut. I mean, I think that, there's so much potential when people introduce live culture foods as a regular part of their diet to improve digestion, improve immune function, potentially improve mental health. I mean, there's so many potential benefits that you might as well give it a try. On the other hand, I mean, there's also anti-carcinogenic compounds in sauerkraut. Like, I'm certainly not going to tell somebody who's just been, diagnosed with, brain cancer, lung cancer, oh, all you need to do is eat a big serving of sauerkraut twice a day and it's going to go away. I mean, it could go like that, but I would always encourage someone to take a multi-pronged approach. And what I can say, I mean, from more than 25 years now of HIV meds, is that almost everyone I've ever met who takes the kind of meds that I have, that I've been taking all these years reports digestive disruptions from them, and I have never experienced that. So, even if you are, using some form of, pharmaceutical medication, if you're a person who's dealing with cancer and you're undergoing chemotherapy, you need sauerkraut more than ever to try to keep your digestion going. So, I mean, I just think that, I think of these foods, and I mean, I say sauerkraut just as a stand-in for live fermented foods, and honestly, I think that if people really want to, you know, enhance biodiversity in the gut, like the best approach is to eat lots of different kinds of fermented foods, because each different kind of fermented food, even like sauerkraut from this farm, sauerkraut from that farm, are going to have, slightly different communities of microorganisms. So if your objective is enhancing biodiversity, eat as many different kinds of fermented foods as you can, and don't forget to eat more fiber. But I also think it's really important to tell people, like, that this is not like a prescription that's going to sort of, necessarily address what's ailing you. I mean, maybe it will, but maybe it won't.
Right, brilliant. Given that the appropriate framework, right, as you've just outlined, really important piece there. What is it that we're looking to do for somebody interested, right, in pursuing this? Is it breadth of fermented foods? Is it quality of fermented foods? Are there certain times of the day that are great to have these? Are there certain food combinings that are useful for people to pursue? Like, what's the general advice? Say someone's passionate about following that option and really maximizing the potential benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't really tell you about time of day. I mean, I think that, the time of day that they feel appealing to you is when you should eat them. And, I mean, I would say eat them 2, 3 times a day. I mean, generally, I would say the best thing you could do is eat them every time you eat. Eat some kind of fermented thing. And this is really like the Korean approach. Like, most people in Korea are eating, some kind of kimchi with every meal. And I'm not saying you need to start eating kimchi with every meal, but just like, think about, with any meal, think about, which of the ferments could go nicely with this. And in general, I think that they're very versatile, and we can think of them often as condiments. I'll put them on sandwiches. I'll have them with eggs. I'll have them with rice. I'll have them with almost anything, really. But I mean, I think just like, making different variants, buying different variants, just trying different combinations. And of course, vegetables aren't the only thing that can be fermented. Fermented dairy products generally have their live cultures intact. And those are, really very widely available for purchase in markets. There's nothing that can't be fermented. I mean, anything you could possibly eat can be fermented. I mean, right behind me, I have a batter made from mung beans and rice, and I soak them overnight, and then I put them in a blender, and I blend them into a batter, add a little bit of salt to it, ferment it for a day or 2 or 3. The warmer it is, the faster the fermentation is going to go. The cooler it is, the slower it's going to go. Now, in this case, I cook it. I mean, I turn it into a pancake. So, I'm not getting the live cultures. I mean, not all fermented foods are always eaten raw. I mean, you still get certain benefits from them, specifically pre-digestion. So, the nutrients of those mung beans, the nutrients of that rice become more bioavailable because of the fact of fermenting it. So even though I'm killing the yeast and bacteria and making a pancake out of it and cooking it, I'm still getting more out of the mung beans and the rice than I would. And I mean, not to mention a superior flavor and a very pleasing texture. So, I mean, food is not just about probiotics. There's a lot of different dimensions to it. For anyone who's interested in fermentation, I mean, the biggest thing I would say is don't be intimidated. Just try it. The basics could not be simpler. If you want to try fermenting vegetables, I'm going to describe the process in like 30 seconds. You shred the vegetables to create surface area. Add some salt. There's no magic number. I like to keep it pretty low salt myself, but what I would say is you don't even need to measure or weigh the salt. Just salt lightly, mix it all up, taste it, add more salt if you think it needs more salt. Salt draws a little water out of the vegetables, gets them nice and juicy. You can enhance that or speed that by squeezing them a little bit. Once the veggies are juicy, pack them into a jar with some force so that the vegetables are submerged under their juices with a little bit of salt, add any kind of seasonings that you like, and then you just wait.
It would be wonderful if this was a video podcast because people could see this amazing kitchen behind you as you're talking to us. And you were just talking about the mung, reminded me of like a dosa of sorts.
Very much like a dosa, same general process.
Speaking of this, in terms of experimenting and trying things, people love a story. I love a story. I'd love to know, did you have any kind of like early failures or just like funky, strange experiments in your fermentation journeys that you want to share? What comes to mind? I'm sure there's some pretty radical stuff you've tried out.
And I still do. If you're going to experiment, you're going to have some failures. And the thing about fermentation is like, okay, you could come and I could be your private tutor for 6 months. You could take a class with me, maybe an intensive class that's a week. You could read my book and 100 other books. You could search YouTube and spend the next 5 years watching videos showing you how to ferment different things. But neither like the mentor or the teacher or the book or the video can do it for you. So you have to do your best to understand the environment you're trying to create and create it. And then trust me, the process will become your teacher. So like the first sourdough bread you make will not be the best bread you've ever eaten, but it will teach you how to do it better. And maybe a couple of batches later, it will be the best bread you've ever eaten. So all of these things have a little bit of a learning curve. My worst failures have really been when I have failed to adequately protect things from flies. And so, let's say you have a crock of sauerkraut and a fly finds its way in and lays some eggs on the surface of it. When you go to dig out your sauerkraut and eat it, you're going to find little wormy maggots crawling out. So, I mean, that's really just like a failure of protecting it from the environment. So you'd need to seal it a little bit better to keep the flies out of there. So yeah, sure, I've had all kinds of failures. Anyone who jumps into this, the biggest thing that can go wrong with fermenting vegetables is getting the vegetables submerged to protect them from oxygen because oxygen in the air will support the growth of molds, and you want like the bacteria to be able to grow. The lactic acid bacteria is always there in vegetables. They are anaerobic. They don't require oxygen. So we're basically trying to protect them to give them an advantage. But there's always a surface where it meets the oxygen. And, sometimes when I do big talks, I'll say, how many people here have ever fermented vegetables? And I'll see a bunch of hands go up. And then I'll say, how many of you have ever experienced any kind of comm yeast or other kind of like funky surface growth? And all the same hands go up because it's just such an inevitable part of the process. And by the way, this kind of funky surface growth is not a failure. It doesn't mean you have to throw it away. What most of us do is we just skim it off the top as best we can. There do exist technologies that can protect the surface completely from any exposure to air or oxygen. I mostly don't use them because it's not a big deal to scrape it off. I've even in China, I watch people just mix it back in. It's just utterly harmless. The yeast layer that can grow on the top of sauerkraut. So I know a lot of sauerkraut's been thrown away because of this. So I would just urge people to recognize that it's a very typical experience, and you can just skim it off, and you don't need to throw it away.
Keith said before, this is the future of wellness, as it were, the podcast. We often ask people what their hopes are, their ambitions, their aspirations, or just, gentle desires for the future of their field and how they're contributing. something you'd like to see for this world of wellness in the field relative to your own or elsewhere for how people may approach their health and well-being in the future?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I mean, I think that I would encourage people to get more connected to to their local environment, to plants, to soil, or if they can't do that directly, at least like by association to, local food producers. I mean, I guess I would say that my greatest hope for the future is, mostly has to do with, decentralizing food production, and moving away from, the model of, mass production and global distribution, and, more towards, like a locally focused, model of food. And I think that, that would not only enhance, our personal wellness, but also, the wellness of, our ecological systems, as well as our economic systems.
If people want to find your work, where can they find you? Do you have anything coming up that you want to share?
Well, I have a website, wildfermentation.com. So you can see, where I have workshops coming up. I do quite a bit of traveling, within the US as well as internationally, teaching. So, check out my website, check out my books, Wild Fermentation, The Art of Fermentation, Fermentation Journeys. Then I also have one called, The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved. That's about grassroots movements to reclaim food in different ways. And I also have a book called Fermentation as Metaphor, and I've just recently finished A Natural History of Fermentation. So check out my books, check out my website, and I described how easy it is to ferment vegetables. Give it a try.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful getting all this information from you, getting to connect with you. As Christabel mentioned, we saw you at a workshop some time ago, and we really wanted to connect. We're glad we had that opportunity, and that you did too. This is really important stuff that you are sharing, and so we'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes, and we definitely recommend people check out your work. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom today, Sandor.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being a part of the Future of Wellness. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review. It helps us reach more people and to make great episodes like this one. Learn more about field dynamics and why we think the future of wellness matters. Check us out at energyfielddynamics.com. See you next time.